Recognize the senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, we're just 17 days into the Trump, Vance, and yes, Elon Musk administration, and we're already witnessing the great betrayal of what candidate Trump promised on the campaign trail. For the last 17 days, the Trump-Musk administration has been engaged in a reckless abuse of power that is already harming people in communities throughout our country. And one of the principal architects of this chaos is the man who was nominated to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought. But before I get into that nomination, let's just start with day one of the Trump administration. Because on day one, President Trump pardoned individuals convicted in a court of law of beating up police officers here on Capitol Hill on January 6th. They bludgeoned them, they beat them, assaulted them. As the National Fraternal Order of Police said, that pardon sent a terrible message to law enforcement all over the country. It sent the message that political violence is okay as long as it's done in the name of Donald Trump. And since then, we've seen the Trump administration carry out retribution against FBI agents and Department of Justice officials who were part of the investigations and prosecutions of the people who beat up police officers on January 6th. So if you were part of the effort to hold people accountable for assaulting police officers, they went after you. Sends a terrible message. And then, of course, President Trump unleashed Elon Musk on the American people. I've said it before, and I will say it again. We are witnessing in real time the most corrupt bargain in American history. Elon Musk spent over $280 million to elect Donald Trump, and Donald Trump has handed the keys to the U.S. government over to Elon Musk. They seized access to the Treasury's payment system. This is a $6 trillion payment system. Elon Musk's DOGE boys have gotten access to Social Security numbers of the American people, bank account numbers, and other very sensitive personal information. Judges are trying to rein him in, but who knows what information they've already accessed and what kind of damage has already been done, not to mention what could still be done in the days ahead. And Elon Musk has gotten into the Department of Education, the State Department, AID, Health and Human Services, NOAA, and the National Institutes of Health, just to name a few. Mr. President, no matter what name he gives it, Elon Musk's takeover of these federal agencies has nothing to do with government efficiency. If it was about government efficiency, Trump would not have illegally fired the inspector generals whose job it is to provide oversight at these agencies and blow the whistle on corruption. In fact, when you fire the inspector generals, who are the watchdogs at these agencies, whose job it is to look out for waste or fraud or abuse, when you fire them as one of your first acts, what you're doing is making the way, clearing the way for the kind of illegal actions we're seeing from Elon Musk and his team. So what they're really doing here is seizing control of the government, taking over a lot of these agencies, in the long run to empower further the very powerful and the very wealthiest in this country. And we'll be seeing more of that in the months ahead when we begin to see the Trump tax plan, the trickle-down tax plan that's being worked on as we speak. because we know that although candidate Trump campaigned on the idea that he was going to be on the lookout for working people, that he was going to shine a light on the forgotten Americans, everything he's done since then is a betrayal of that promise. Just down the hall here, during the inauguration, the folks who were sitting behind President Trump as he gave his remarks were certainly not the forgotten Americans. They included Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, and all the billionaire tech titans. So when President Trump in that inaugural address promised a new golden age for America, he was looking at the cameras, but he was talking to those tech titans sitting right behind him. And to provide that golden age for the billionaires and powerful in America, they're following a manual and an instruction book called Project 2025. Now, people might remember that during the last presidential campaign, candidate Trump was asked repeatedly about Project 2025. People said, "Is this your plan that's being put forward?" And his response was, and I quote, "I have nothing to do with it," unquote. You know why he said that on the campaign trail? Because he knew it was unpopular. If you look at the contents of Project 2025, the American people would recoil at what's in there. And candidate Trump knew that. And so when he was asked, he said, "I see nothing, I have nothing to do with that." So surprise, 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 when one of the key architects, key authors of Project 2025, Russell Vought, is nominated to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget at the White House. So before I speak to why it will be so dangerous to put Russell Vought in that critical position, I want to say a few words about what OMB is all about. Because it's not a well-known agency. People hear about the Department of Justice. They hear about other important federal agencies, the Department of Health and Human Services. But what is OMB? OMB is the office over at the White House. It's in the executive office of the president. And it is the command and control center for the budget of the United States government. It oversees the budgets of every federal agency of the federal government. They feed their information, they feed their budget requests up to the Office of Management and Budget. And it's the Office of Management and Budget that makes the final decisions and sign off on all of those federal agency budgets across the government. So as I say, Russell Vought will be in the cockpit of this decision-making, overseeing every federal agency in our government. So let's learn a little bit more about Russell Vought, because we will be voting on that nomination later today. So what does he think about the federal employees in all of those agencies that OMB will oversee with respect to their budgets? Here's what he said about government employees, and I'm quoting here. He wants them to be, this is quote, be traumatically effective. When they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. We want to put them in trauma, unquote. Again, referring to hardworking federal employees who do good work on behalf of the American people every day. We want to put them in trauma, he said. And if anybody doubts this quote, You just have to go online because it's on videotape. It's on videotape for the whole world to see. In fact, he didn't try and deny those words, and at the confirmation hearing we had in the Budget Committee that I serve on, we asked if he wanted to apologize for those statements, and his answer was no. He refused to apologize. That's what the person who's nominated to be the head of OMB thinks about the federal employees throughout the federal government that are going to be under that OMB budget process. Now, at that budget hearing, the Senate Budget Committee hearing, there was another very revealing moment, because I and Senator Murray asked whether or not he would commit to complying with American law, specifically whether he would comply with what's known as the Impoundment Control Act. Now, again, this is a law that many people are not familiar with, but it is essential to the framework of our Constitution, the implementation of that framework, and checks and balances within the government, and the power of the purse that is designated for Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. And what the Impoundment Control Act says is that once Congress has duly enacted a law, passed the House, passed the Senate, been signed into law by the executive, by the president, that presidents don't get to cherry pick that law. Presidents don't get to decide, you know, I like that provision in the law, and so I'm going to implement that, but I don't like that provision, so I'm going to ignore it or discard it. It's not a la carte. Our laws are not a la carte. They're not for presidents to decide what parts they want to follow and what parts they won't. This came to a head back in the 1970s when President Nixon started exercising what are called line item vetoes. So Congress would pass a piece of legislation that would require that certain amounts of funds be spent on certain projects. And President Nixon took a pen and said, look, I don't like that particular program. I'm going to cross it out. And I don't like this one. I'm going to cross it out, even though it had been part of the law passed by Congress and signed by the president. And so that was challenged, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck down President Nixon's action. And the Congress then passed the Impoundment Control Act to create a federal statute essentially codifying that requirement, that presidents follow the law with respect to budget implementation. So when we asked Russ Vought at the hearing whether or not he would follow the Impoundment Control Act, you would think all of our colleagues would care about what answer he gave. Because at that hearing, he refused to say that he would comply with the Impoundment Control Act. Again, you can go see the C-SPAN tape. You can get the transcript. He weaved and dodged and never said that he would comply with the law. And maybe that shouldn't surprise us because he's done this before. You see, this will be Russ Vaught's second tour as the head of the Office of Management and Budget if he's confirmed by the United States Senate. And on his first go-round in the first Trump administration, this issue came up. That was when President Trump in his first term withheld critical funds appropriated by Congress on a bipartisan basis for the people of Ukraine, to help the people of Ukraine. That was done through the duly authorized processes of government. But President Trump wanted to hold on to those monies. He did not want to obey the law. He didn't want to disperse those funds to Ukraine. That created a huge issue, crisis in governance. So at that time, I wrote to the GAO, which is the congressional watchdog. Their designated to look out to see whether or not these laws are actually implemented and followed. And I got back a response. I wrote them in December of 2019 about this withholding of funds for Ukraine. And I got back the letter on January 16, 2020, with their answer. And in this letter, GAO says, and I quote, "Faithful execution of the law does not permit the president to substitute his own policy priorities for those Congress has enacted into law," end quote. Pretty standard definition of what everybody would normally understand to be the requirements of the Constitution. And since the Trump administration and Russ Vought violated that, the GAO concluded, and I'll just read the operative sentence, "Therefore, we conclude that OMB violated the Impoundment Control Act." Simple, declarative sentence saying that they violated the law. And the person who was the head of OMB when they violated that law was Russ Vought, the person who's nominated for another tour of duty as the head of OMB. So the whole idea behind the Impoundment Control Act, as I've discussed, is the president's not a king in our system. We have a system of checks and balances. And under Article 1 of the Constitution, the first article, Congress has the power to appropriate funds and direct the use of those funds. And we do it through bipartisan debate in both houses of Congress. So when Russ Vought refuses to promise he will comply with the law, what he's saying is he will not respect the Constitution of the United States. And if we witness what's been happening just in the first 17 days of the Trump administration, we're seeing this disrespect for the law in action by the White House, including by OMB, and Russ Vought's not even gotten there yet, but his fingerprints are all over the actions taken to date. Because I think people will remember, seems like a long time ago now, but OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, issued a statement. The president issued an executive order, and then they issued a statement that, quote, temporarily paused all activities related to the obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance, end quote. So immediately upon them taking that action, we saw community organizations all over the country all of a sudden not able to receive really important resources that they use to support priorities in our country. So I began to hear, for example, from firefighters in the state of Maryland, volunteer firefighters. I also began to hear from those groups that provide assistance to victims of domestic violence, to organizations that help remove lead from our water so our kids don't get lead poisoning, initiatives to improve the health of the Chesapeake Bay, my state of Maryland. Now, at the time, it was claimed that Medicaid was exempt from this order, but states at that time were locked out of their Medicaid payment portals. So to my colleagues on the Republican side who said, this is just part of the normal process of transition in government, this is not normal. And Elon Musk taking over federal agencies is not normal. So, as I said, I heard first from a lot of the volunteer fire departments in my state of Maryland, because there's a federal program, grant program, that helps them purchase equipment so that when firefighters go into a burning building, they have protective equipment and safety equipment that lets them breathe in a room full of smoke. We heard immediately from a housing agency in Maryland that helps hundreds of families find safe, affordable places to stay. They were suddenly locked out of the portal for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. An organization in Prince George's County, Maryland, that uses federal grants to help survivors of sex and labor trafficking reclaim their lives, saw their funds in jeopardy. A nonprofit in Baltimore County that uses federal funds to provide food, housing, and emergency assistance to families in need, they also saw their funding cut off. In Montgomery County, Maryland, there's a nonprofit that uses this federal grant money to run programs for permanent supportive housing, to take care of senior men with disabilities. Many of these elderly gentlemen have experienced extended bouts of homelessness, and they currently have a place to live with dignity in a small neighborhood with the care they need. If they lose their money, they lose their support, they will all end up in shelters. So, Mr. President, I'm pleased that the courts looked at that action that was taken through executive order. They looked at that OMB memo cutting off the flow of funds for essential community programs. And the court said, no, you can't do this. We need time to determine what all the facts are here. And two courts issued temporary restraining orders on that action. One a court in Rhode Island, a federal court, and one here in the District of Columbia. But this administration is still at it in many different ways. They're still issuing executive orders when, in fact, they cannot do what they want to do by executive order. They need to come to Congress and go through the process for making laws. Presidents just can't issue EOs that are not consistent with their powers under the Constitution. I spoke earlier today about what was happening over at the Agency for International Development, an agency, a pretty small agency within the overall budget of the United States that plays an essential role in our foreign policy and our national security policy. Elon Musk, sent out a tweet saying that he was putting AID in the wood chipper. This is an organization that saves lives overseas, and one of the things they do is help other countries combat infectious diseases so we can stop them overseas before they come to the United States, because, of course, infectious diseases recognize no borders. As part of that, they cut off funding for the PEPFAR program, which is a bipartisan initiative first launched by George W. Bush. It's a program in Africa that has saved over 25 million lives from HIV/AIDS. Put it in the wood chipper. That's what they want to do. So I am grateful that the courts have intervened and halted, at least for now, these illegal actions. But, Mr. President, we should not rely on the courts of the United States to do work that we should be doing here. We should not be insisting that they have to fight all of our battles for us. We need to be pushing back here in the United States Senate. We are not a government for Elon Musk, by Elon Musk. We are a government of the people. At least last I checked the Constitution, it begins, we, the people. So this is a reminder of why these nominations are so important, because the person who we're considering for the head of OMB wants to ignore that law. But that's only part one of the plan outlined in Project 2025 to allow for the Elon Musk takeover of the federal government and allow for these other illegal actions to be taken. I spoke about the Impoundment Control Act, but the other part of Project 2025's plan is to get rid of a lot of the merit-based federal workers who do the business of the U.S. government every day in agencies across the federal government, whether they're food safety inspectors, whether they work at veterans hospitals, whether they work for the FAA. These are people who are doing the nation's work on behalf of the American people. And what Project 2025 wants to do is to convert many of those merit-based civil service positions in our government to political cronyism-based positions. So rather than have people selected into the merit civil service system based on their knowledge, based on their experience, based on what they know as opposed to who they know, Vought and Project 2025 want to convert about 50 to 60,000 merit-based civil service positions into political cronyism positions. Now, I think it's really important that everybody understand that when a new president comes into office, the president, of course, has the prerogative and authority to bring in lots of people at the top of that administration. Of course, many of them are cabinet officials or other officials who are subject to the advice and consent of the United States Senate. But there are tens of thousands of others who are currently civil servants, but when a new president comes in, they get about 4,000 political positions. 4,000 people. But what we're seeing here from Project 2025 and Vought is what's called Section F plan, Schedule F. So what does Schedule F do? It would implement this idea of giving the president or claiming to, by executive order, convert these 50 to 60,000 merit-based civil service positions into just politically based positions. So why do we have a merit-based civil service in this country? I think it's worth going back and looking at the history, because we've had the merit-based system since the late 1800s, and it's that system that Donald Trump and Vought want to tear up. So why did we develop the current system? It used to be that these federal positions were based on the spoils system, the spoils of political victory. So when a new president came in, that president could just bring in whoever the new president wanted. If you wanted to be in charge of a harbor or run a post office, you didn't get there by knowing about ships in the case of the harbor, or a mail system in the case of a post office. You got it by helping the president get elected. And then the president would say, well, you helped me get elected, you're going to get this job, even if you're not qualified. So, Mr. President, if these desks, these 100 desks in this chamber, could talk, they would be screaming a warning to us about the dangers of going down the road that Vought and Donald Trump and Elon Musk want us to go. Here's what Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky said during that debate back in the 1800s about the existing spoil system that was in effect then. Here's what he said, and I quote, "It is a detestable system, and if it were to be perpetuated, if the offices, honors, and dignities of the people were to be put up to public scramble, to be decided by the result of every presidential election, our government and institutions becoming intolerable would finally end in despotism," end quote. That was the warning from Henry Clay about that old spoil system that Trump, Musk, and Vought want to go back to. Here's what Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts said back then, and I quote, "The power of giving offices affects all who are in and all who are out. Those who are out endeavor to distinguish themselves by warm personal devotion to the president, while those who are in resolve not to be outdone in partisanship. A competition ensues, not of patriotic labors, not of rough and severe toils for the public good, but of complacence, of indiscriminate support of the executive measures, of pliant subserviency and gross adulation," unquote. We want our federal employees, the rank and file folks who do the work of the country every day, we don't want them to have to take a political loyalty test to get their job. We want them to take a test that shows they've got the qualifications to get it. Here's what Senator Warner Miller of New York said, quote, "Worthiness can no longer gain an entrance to public office, but that it can only come through the favor of some man who has climbed up by this system until he is in a position to reward his followers." Again, warning of the peril of politicizing the hiring of federal employees that conduct the everyday work of our government. And finally, Senator Charles of Missouri said, and I quote, "Under such a system, it cannot be otherwise but inexperience and rascality. You are no longer surprised at the frequency of mail robberies which are perpetrated in post offices. You see the smugglers in the ports lying in wait to take advantage of the inexperience of new officers or the aid of dishonest ones," unquote. And even the great author Mark Twain got in the action here and commented on that system that we had, the spoils system based on politics, not merit. Here's what Mark Twain said, and I quote, "We will not hire a blacksmith who never lifted a wedge. We will not hire a school teacher who does not know the alphabet. But when you come to our civil service, we serenely fill great numbers of our minor public offices with ignoramuses," unquote. So this was a big problem for the country back in the 1800s. Indeed, in his inaugural address in 1881, President James Garfield said, and I quote, "The civil service can never be satisfactory until it is regulated by law. For the good of the service, against the waste of time and obstruction to the public business caused by the inordinate pressure, and for the protection of civil servants against intrigue and wrong," unquote. In other words, again, this is President Garfield warning that the system that had been in place was a danger to the public good. So President Garfield provided a warning to the country. It didn't come soon enough. They hadn't enacted the legislation to fix the problem yet. And 6 months after that inauguration, President Garfield was shot and killed, assassinated by a man who worked on the Garfield campaign, but who was disappointed over not getting a spoils job. President Garfield's assassination, his death, shocked Congress into action. So they finally created the modern civil service process to be insulated from politics, at least with respect to all the jobs under the top political jobs which presidents have the right and authority to hire. They created through the Pendleton Act what we call the merit-based civil service, where you have due process rights, that you can't be fired because of your political affiliation, and you don't get hired based on who you know, you get hired based on what you know. And so this is the system that Russ Vought and President Trump and Elon Musk want to destroy through Schedule F, an executive order, Schedule F. Now, look, the good news is that I think at least 3 lawsuits have already been filed to try to enjoin this illegal action. But it should tell us a lot that the person who has been nominated to head OMB, the person who said that he refused to commit to complying with the law during his Budget Committee hearing, would be advancing Schedule F. And why do that? Because it's all part of the plan to put in place lackeys who will do your bidding no matter what, who won't put the interests of the country first, but who will answer to the political call. Exactly what senators back in the late 1800s warned against. But that's what they want to do. They want to take us back to the late 1800s spoil system. And as I said, they not only want to bring in 50 to 60,000 political cronies for these positions, one of the first acts President Trump took was to get rid of the inspector generals. So you bring in your lackeys, you get rid of the independent inspector generals, and that just gives Elon Musk carte blanche to do what he is currently doing right now. So this has nothing to do with more government efficiency and everything to do with setting up the executive branch of the federal government to respond to the desires of the folks who were sitting right behind President Trump, right down the hall at his inauguration, Elon Musk and the billionaire tech titans and others like them. And one of the things that the billionaires want are even more tax cuts. They don't like the fact that as very wealthy people, they have to make a contribution to the public good, or they want to reduce the contribution they have to make. And we know that Republicans over in the House of Representatives have been down in Miami with President Trump, planning exactly what form all these tax cuts will take. Well, I don't think we really have to guess at it because we've seen this movie before in the first Trump administration. They enacted their trickle-down tax policy, big tax cuts for the wealthiest in America, tax cuts for big, very profitable corporations, and they made a lot of promises back then as to what the result would be. For example, they promised that giving tax cuts to very rich people in these corporations would end up generating so much additional economic activity that we would recover the cost of the revenues lost by giving those very wealthy people a tax cut. Not even close. Not even close. Deficits went way up. As I said, I serve on the Senate Budget Committee. I ask experts from both parties who come testify on different issues about whether or not that tax cut paid for itself, and the answer is always no, because it didn't. Now, they also promised that these tax cuts to very wealthy people would end up generating additional activity at the corporate level. So the idea was that if you give a corporation a big tax cut, that corporation will invest more of its savings that it has into plant and equipment and grow the economy. Well, that didn't happen either. What happened was those companies engaged in huge stock buybacks, which disproportionately benefited these huge stockholders. You know what else they promised? They promised that if you gave those corporations big tax cuts, that they would use some of the savings to increase the wages for their employees. After all, profits of corporations are generated by the hard work of their employees. So the idea was, okay, you have more money, you got this tax cut. At that time, President Trump and his administration promised that workers would see an average of a $4,000 a year pay increase. Did not happen as promised. So here we are again, And the Musk folks are going through federal agencies. Russ Vought is working to install himself again at OMB. And all of this is a prelude to another round of big tax cuts. And again, these are going to come at the expense of everybody else in America. Because even as we gather here, we've been seeing various plans come out of the House of Representatives Republican caucus. They're talking about dramatic cuts to Medicaid, which is a program that serves tens and tens of millions of people, including our seniors and people with disabilities. They're talking about dramatic cuts to food nutrition programs and many, many, many other cuts to important investments for working Americans across the country, all to help pay for or offset the costs of those tax cuts for the wealthy. Now, I think we've also heard President Trump talk about all the money he's going to collect in tariffs. And I want to say something about tariffs here, because I support strategically targeted tariffs to protect critical American industries. But an across-the-board tariff on every single product being imported in the United States, that is nothing more than an increase in sales tax on every American. Americans pay that at the end of the day. And I can tell you that Elon Musk is not going to feel the impact of an increase in sales tax, the tariff increase on his bottom line. But working Americans will feel it around their kitchen tables. We will see grocery prices go up. We'll see other prices go up. In fact, if you think that this is somehow a freebie that is only paid by other countries, let's remember that last time, after China retaliated with their own tariffs, the Congress, passed a bill that provided $28 billion of taxpayer money to farmers who were no longer able to sell as much product into China because of the retaliatory tariffs to China. We all end up paying, the American people ended up paying $28 billion. So don't tell us there's not a cost to consumers and American taxpayers for all of this. There is. We'll have a lot more to say in the coming days about some of the accounting tricks we're already hearing are going to be played through this tax cut process that will hide, at least on paper, the impact on the deficits. But right now, we're hearing about directing the Congressional Budget Office, which is our independent referee on budget issues, to assume that big tax cuts on top of the current law won't generate increased deficits. What, of course they will. So more on that later. So, Mr. President, I want to end just by talking a little bit about why this is such an important moment. I started by talking about the first 17 days. In that first 17 days, we have seen President Trump hand over to Elon Musk huge powers, and he's using that entree given by the president to conduct illegal operations across the federal government. Courts are very busy today. It's like whack-a-mole, hearing cases, putting TROs, temporary restraining orders, on cases. But as I said, they shouldn't have to do that. The courts shouldn't have to do that. You would think that members of the Senate would stand up and respect the Constitution of the United States and Article 1. What are my Republican colleagues going to do when we have a Democratic president that says, I get to cherry pick the laws of the United States? I'll just implement what I like and ignore what you passed into law. That's what's at stake here. That's the danger when Russ Vought, who's going to be in the cockpit at OMB, the Command and Control Center for the budget of the U.S. government, refuses at a budget committee hearing to say he'll comply with the law. It's no wonder that the Republicans did not want to hold the vote on Russ Vought in committee in public. They wanted to have it behind closed doors here in the Capitol. That's why Democrats on that committee didn't show up, because we think the public has a right to know what's at stake here. And that's what we're debating now here on the floor. So I urge my colleagues to recognize that the person that Donald Trump has nominated for this position is somebody who said he wanted to visit hardships on the federal employees throughout the federal government, and a person who refused to say that he would follow the law. Colleagues, I urge a no vote on Russ Vought to be the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and I yield the floor.